Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Talib Kılıç. I'm with the World Bank Development Data Group, and I'm also part of the Living Standards Measurement Study team. Today, I'm privileged to chair this session, ILO World Bank Special Session, Measuring Women's and Men's Work, Main Findings and Recommendations from World Bank and ILO Pilot Studies. The session is going to be providing an overview of pilot studies conducted by ILO, as well as joint methodological work conducted by ILO and the World Bank to provide guidance on the operationalizations of ICLS 19th, which revisited definitions of employment, unemployment, and work more broadly, and introduce new metrics related to labor underutilization. So today's session will have 3 presentations. We'll get started with Kieran Walsh from ILO, followed by Gaddis of the World Bank, and lastly concluding with Antonio Discenza and Amparo Palacios-Lopez. I'm going to be keeping time. So when we have about 2 minutes to go for each presentation, I will give you a shout out. For those that are joining us for the first time today, if you have any questions along the way, please use the chat function. As a participant, you can either send your questions to the host, or you can send your questions to the panelists. If you send your questions to the attendees, we will not be able to see them. So make sure to send your questions to either to the host or the panelist. We have a 75-minute session. We also carve out some time at the end for more Q&A to the extent that we can. To the extent that we cannot cover them, I guess, through the chat box. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Kieran Walsh to give the first presentation of the session. So just a brief introduction to Kieran. He's a senior statistician in the labor force survey methodology team at the International Labour Organization Department of Statistics. The primary focus of his work is developing guidance and providing training and support to countries on the application of the latest standards and good measurement practices for labor and household surveys. Kieran, over to you.
Great, thank you, Talib. So hopefully everyone can hear me and see the presentation. And bearing in mind that time is very tight, I'm going to get straight into it. So as a starting point for the session, I want to give an important piece of background, which Talib already mentioned. And that is the set of standards that were agreed or adopted at the 19th International Conference of Labour Statisticians. So the real background here is that every 5 years, there is a conference which is held to discuss new standards on statistics in the domain of labor, and it's called the International Conference of Labour Statisticians. It's been meeting since 1923 with very few interruptions. And the new standards that are adopted at any given conference are developed following a very extensive consultation and development process that is hosted by the International Labour Organization. We set up a working group, we have regional consultations, etc. So a lot of time goes into it. And the 19th ICLS, which took place in 2013, was particularly noteworthy in the sense that it provided a key update to the standards that provide the core definitions that we use in labor. These are the statistical definitions of employment and unemployment in particular. And those definitions had previously been adopted in 1982 at the 13th ICLS. So this was over 30 years in the making, building on the experiences of applying those old standards and learning from them and learning what the weaknesses or the gaps were, that new standards were adopted in 2013. And what do they contain? Well, the first thing that they contain is a wider definition of work, so a concept that is wider than employment. all paid and unpaid working activities. And within that, multiple forms of work. And this relates very closely, obviously, to labor market statistics, because one of those forms of work is employment. And as a consequence of the updated definitions of work and employment, of course, we had to revisit the definition of unemployment, as they're directly related. And as Talib already mentioned, we have a wider range of labour underutilisation indicators now proposed to supplement the unemployment rate, which remains a key indicator, but it is recognised that it doesn't identify or cover all situations where people have underutilised labour. So additional indicators have been proposed to fill that gap. So a key aspect of the new set of standards is what we call the forms of work framework. And what this does is it establishes a definition of work overall. So, you know, what is work? It's any activity done to produce goods or services for consumption by the person themselves, their households, or other people. So it's a very, very wide definition. And we can distinguish different forms of work based on a set of criteria. The first is the intended destination of the good or service produced. So if it's for your own use or for use of your household, that is now referred to as own use production work, this part on the left here. If it's for use by others, we can now distinguish different forms of work depending on the type of transaction or the intention of the person in undertaking that work. Work that is done for pay or profit is now, under the new definitions, what we refer to as employment. And we have other forms of work where people are not paid, it's not being done for pay or profit, including volunteer work and unpaid training work. Now, what I think is key to note about this is that this black box here is what conceptually was referred to as employment under the 1982 standards. It covered all goods and services, all goods being produced for consumption by yourself or others, plus quite a lot of services that were being produced by people. The exclusions were services done on a voluntary capacity or services done for your own household. Everything else that you see here was conceptually included under the old definition. But in reality, there were very inconsistent measurement practices. Now, employment, as now defined, is the reference concept for labour force statistics, as it always has been, albeit with a different definition. And we just have to note that there is a practical implication that this narrower definition of work that we can see here would be expected to generate lower estimates of employment and higher estimates of unemployment because of these changes in definition. Now, what are the objectives of doing this? Obviously, this is a major change. We want to have a very good reason for doing this. Well, there are multiple objectives, and I'm only capturing a handful here. One of them is greater granularity in the measurement of working activities to better distinguish the different types of activity we undertake based on the intention at the time the work was being done. So now we can distinguish unpaid care work and other household service work from work done to produce goods for your own consumption, from employment, from volunteer work. Under the old standards, there was simply employment, and many things fit within that box, including many unpaid activities, at least in theory, maybe not always in practice. It gives us a more complete and transparent accounting of all work, particularly if we measure multiple working activities at the same time, which is now promoted under these standards. We believe there's a better alignment with policy, and this was an important motivation. The argument that such a wide definition of employment didn't fit with a concept of employment that was embodied in much policy work, right? Where, for example, employment promotion schemes focused very much on work to generate an income, whereas the employment definition covered many unpaid types of work in reality. So there was also a deeper understanding, an objective is that we get a deeper understanding of pressures on the labour market and how they interact with different working activities. So how does unpaid work influence our ability to engage with the labour market? We had no visibility of that under the old standards, whereas now it is feasible. And I would say a practical consideration was improved consistency and comparability within and cross countries, because we had serious comparability issues under the old standards due to inconsistency in measurement practices and definitions applied, and also the country contexts involved. Now, so practical implications, the main one is that countries would need to update surveys where they are trying to capture labor if they want to apply these new standards. They need additional questions in various ways, for which careful design and testing is required. We also say that a main implication is very much a communications challenge. Strong communications are needed to advocate for and explain the changes in advance, and also then once they're made. We do need to note that breaks in series may arise, which is a pain in the head for many people. But I would note, without going into it in detail, that some mitigation is possible with appropriate survey design. In other words, the ability to link series and have some sort of continuity. And critically, it's essential to measure different forms of work and consider the implications this has for use of the data. So if you find that an employment estimate drops and you're using that for productivity estimation, you have to consider what that means for the numerator in that estimate. All right, they should be aligned. So it can be dealt with, but it has to be considered, or it can cause serious difficulties. Now, recognizing all these challenges, the ICLS in 2013 asked the ILO to do methodological studies so that we could provide guidance on questionnaire designs to meet these various needs, recognizing that this is something, frankly, we had been weak on in the past. We provided conceptual definitions and guidance, but not very practical guidance in the form of model questionnaires and related guidance. So this is where the ILO pilot studies came in. Phase 1 started at the end of 2014. Bearing in mind the standards were adopted in October 2013. This was practically lightning speed by our standards, I would say. And we decided to test the performance of different model questionnaires in different countries and contexts. So we didn't just want to take one questionnaire and test it in one place. We wanted to test different versions in different places to find out what works best. Now, at that time, the World Bank and FAO were doing similar studies using different types of surveys in different countries, but this did not really allow us to directly compare findings from different types of survey. We did share a lot of knowledge through the Women's Work and Employment Partnership hosted by Data2X, which has allowed us to build up good relationships and closer working collaboration. But at that time, we weren't able to directly compare results, which over time became an obvious gap in our work and knowledge. So what did we actually do? We developed 5 model questionnaires reflecting different approaches used around the world for LFS at that time, because as I mentioned earlier, we had inconsistent measurement practices in place. We picked 10 countries, 4 in Africa, 2 in Asia Pacific, 2 in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and 1 in Latin America. 2 in Latin America. And what we did was we tested 2 questionnaires in each country. We did 2 rounds of testing. There was cognitive interviews, and then split sample design quantitative studies, so field testing, with 400 households per questionnaire, visiting twice. So basically, it was quite a substantial study that we were undertaking to allow comparisons of different questionnaires within a country and across countries. And ultimately, the aim was to see whether the different questionnaires had differences in terms of the validity of measurement, the comprehensiveness of coverage of different concepts, and the burden involved. So some of the main findings, there are very many, but I'm just going to give a very brief selection. Alternative question structures or models may lead to equivalent results. So of the 5 questionnaire types we tested, 4 gave consistent results on employment. Only 1 gave a result in employment that actually wasn't, let's say, within the confidence interval of the others. 4 were very, very consistent and 1 was inconsistent. To comprehensively cover employment as it's defined requires careful design regardless of the model you use. And there are some key topics which have to take particular attention. One of those is what we call the measurement of the boundary between own-use production of goods and employment. This is based on the main intended destination of the production involved. So if you're mainly consuming it, it's referred to as own-use production. If you're mainly selling it, it's referred to as employment. But you need a way to measure that boundary. You have to have questions for that. It requires very careful attention in questionnaire design. The tested questions that we used in that case did operate well without important difficulties that we observed. But it's something we still felt needed follow-up work. So we've been working on this also with the World Bank colleagues in a more recent round of work. Other findings, model questionnaires require significant adaptation, careful translation, and testing in the national context. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all questionnaire that works in every country and every language. It doesn't exist, but you can provide harmonized models, and if you give guidance on when and where to adapt and how, you can certainly make massive improvements to national practices. The cognitive tests that we did were a new practice for us, but we found them, well, complex, but very, very useful. We learned a lot from them. For example, we noted some comprehension problems across languages and context for terms like profit, which we use very regularly in questionnaires. We found that there were very inconsistent cultural interpretations of that word, and actually no longer use it in our model labour force survey questionnaires in much. We don't use it much. Other things like job, for pay, household, all of these had some sort of comprehension difficulties that caused us to make updates. So one of the suggestions or recommendations we have is that we don't focus so much on direct translation when we're translating to other languages. We have to find equivalent phrases that have the appropriate meaning in those languages. Other main findings, and I don't have much more after this, the comprehensive measurement of both employment and unused production of goods is quite challenging for questionnaire design. I'm sure the World Bank colleagues will agree with that based on their experiences in Sri Lanka. And the measurement of
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, that's enough, I think. Measurement of working time showed the need for respondent-friendly approaches. Anyone who's involved in measurement of working time knows it's complex with various recall problems. We found that the two versions we tested gave equivalent results and appeared to operate fairly well, notwithstanding the fact it's a complex subject. And measurement of participation in own use provision of services, including things like childcare, elder care, various household service activities, is possible with a list of questions, but so you can capture the participation, but capturing time spent accurately is much more difficult. And that's why there has been a lot more work on that topic since, and it continues to this day. We didn't find in general that the questions were gender sensitive. And this was a key issue for us in the design of the surveys, but some activities are more relevant to women than men, and that can create measurement issues that we need to take care of. So we have by now published multiple reports from these pilot studies, including our findings and recommendations. They're listed here and can be found in that link. And we have also published a range of guidance and tools. So we now have model questionnaires, which we propose, 3 different versions. We have a CAPI builder tool. In other words, you go in, you pick the nature of the country, and it generates a CAPI tool for you using the CS Pro application or software. We have other guidance like for population census, which also builds from this, guidance related to COVID-19 and labour statistics, and various other resources that this pilot study program helped us to generate. And we also have a toolkit which will be updated over time. This is model questionnaires, the IT tools, and guidance and good practices, which you can find at this link. And ultimately, they're live documents. They're things we update on an ongoing basis as we gain more experience. And hopefully that about covers my time.
Yes, that is perfect, Kieran. Thank you so much. I'm already receiving questions, so keep the questions coming, and we're gonna have some time at the end to circle back to them. So following Kieran, we're gonna have a presentation from Isis Gaddis from the World Bank, who has employed evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa on redefining employment. So I would like to introduce Isis. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Isis is a senior economist with the World Bank's Gender Group. She previously served as a poverty economist for Tanzania, based in Dar es Salaam. She co-authored the 2016 World Bank Africa Region Flagship Report, Poverty in a Rising Africa, and was a member of the core team of the Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report 2018. Her main research interest is empirical microeconomics with a focus on the measurement and analysis of poverty and inequality, as well as gender, labor, and public service delivery. Isis, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I'll give you a heads up 2 minutes before. Awesome. Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm presenting today on a topic which is who is employed, evidence from sub-Saharan Africa on redefining employment. And this is based on a study which is co-authored with Amparo, Palacios-Lopez, who's presenting later in the session, as well as 2 other colleagues of ours, Mimi Oseni, who's also at the World Bank, and Janneke Peters at Wageningen University. And I do want to acknowledge very generous funding from Hewlett Foundation for this study, but also the Women's Work and Employment Partnership more generally. So by means of introduction, this presentation shows key insights from the World Bank's 19th ICLS pilot studies and the analysis of data from early adopters with regards to the revised employment concept. So I want to make this clear. In this presentation, we really zoom in on the employment concept. We do not consider the broad set of indicators that were proposed by the 19th ICLS, such as own-use production work or labor underutilization. And the questions that we pose are how do the 19th ICLS standards affect farmers' employment classification? What drives such changes, and what are the implications for employment to population ratios and other national or rural urban labor statistics? And throughout this work, we pay special attention to gender differences and try to dig deeper wherever we see that some of the effects differ between men and women. The data were collected between 2015 and 2017. So these were the early stages of 19th ICLS operationalization, and we focus here on multi-topic household surveys because, as you've seen in Kieran's presentation, the ILO was sort of focusing on guidance for labor force surveys and population censuses, while we focused on the core type of survey instruments that the World Bank often supports, which are multi-topic household surveys. A lot of the data sets that we use have a focus on agriculture, which is quite helpful if we want to understand some of the patterns that we see for farmers. And regionally, we emphasize sub-Saharan Africa in this particular presentation, not because we think the new definitions are not important for other regions, but because in general, the distinction between employment and own-use production work is most salient in countries with large agricultural sectors, and a lot of sub-Saharan African countries fall into this category. Our study draws on 4 data sets from 3 countries. You can see them here. I'm not going to read all of them in the interest of time, but just to say that we have 2 data sets from Malawi, one of which is the agricultural labor survey. And the first data set from Malawi is not nationally representative. This is only representatives for 2 districts. This was a data set that was collected as part of the LSMS team's methodological survey research program. But the data are representative for this particular geographic area. And then for Malawi, we also have a national representative survey, the Integrated Household Survey, IHS4. And then in Ghana, we have an agricultural labor survey similar to Malawi. This data set is not national representative. And then in Nigeria, we have another national representative data set. We do not show every single statistic for all 4 data sets, partly because these data sets differ in various ways, but also because we sort of try to leverage the strengths of each of these data sets to answer particular questions. Coming to the main findings, the first point that I want to make is that in many geographic contexts, the majority of farmers are not classified as employed under the 19th ICLS standards, especially at least in the context where we have the data to analyze this question. You see that Ghana is a bit of an outlier in the sense that up to 80% of farmers in Ghana reported producing for sale, which means that they are considered employed under the 19th ICLS standards, but these fractions are much lower in Malawi and Nigeria. As low as 20% in Malawi at the beginning of the season and somewhat higher at the end of the season. We also see that in some cases, there are gender gaps in the sense that fewer female farmers than male farmers are classified as employed. Gender differences are not always statistically significant, but in cases where they go into one direction, which means that women farmers are less likely than male farmers to say that they are producing for sale and hence classified as employed under the 19th ICLS standards. The second point that I want to make, which was already visible on the previous slide, is that generally more farmers tend to produce for sale and are hence therefore considered employed at the end than at the start of the growing season. So that's a finding that we weren't necessarily expecting. So we thought this was quite interesting, that in all 3 countries, we had larger or higher shares of farmers that reported producing for sale at the end of the season than at the start of the season. And you see this among female farmers here in Ghana, where the share increases from 72% to 82%, but you also see it amongst both male and female farmers in Malawi and in Nigeria. And when I say start of the season, what does it mean? It means either right before planting or right after planting. So around the time that farmers were starting to plant. And when we say end of the season, this was typically just after the main harvest. Since this was not necessarily something we were expecting, we tried to dig a little bit deeper, and we do so using the Malawi Agricultural Labor Survey, which collects very granular data on sort of the types of agricultural products that people were engaged in and the intended destination of output for each of these products. And we do see some, what we think are interesting patterns. Farmers tend to reallocate their labor over the course of the season. In particular, they tend to be much more engaged in crop farming at the beginning of the season and then more in livestock rearing at the end of the season. And we think this is one of the mechanisms that sort of drives these changes in farmers' employment classification. And you see this on the table on the right-hand side. So the upper part of the table shows the share of people, or the share of farmers who report being engaged in the production of these different output products over the past 7 days. And at the beginning of the season, 90% of farmers say they were engaged in crop production, and this declines to just above 50% at the end of the season. So pretty sharp decline. If we dig deeper, this is really driven by a very, very sharp drop in maize farming, from 70% at the beginning of the season to just 7% at the end of the season. This is not surprising in a sense, given that end of the season means right after the main maize harvest. So there are probably very little activities to do with respect to maize farming. But it's a big shift. And on the opposite, you see that more people say they were engaged in livestock rearing at the end of the season than at the beginning of the season. This increases from 46% to 73%. And we see increases both for goats and chicken. Now, if you look at the bottom of the table, you see that maize farming in general, or maize production, is mostly for own consumption. On average, at the beginning of the season, when we ask farmers what share of output for maize is intended for sale, they say 11%, so very little. Compared to this, livestock products generally have a higher likelihood to be sold. So for goats, farmers say on average 75%, that's very high, and for chicken they say 20%, which is still quite low, but higher than the figure that we have for maize. So to sum this up, we see that farmers sort of reallocate their labor from crop farming to livestock production, and livestock farming or livestock rearing generally is more likely to be for market purposes than for own consumption purposes. And we think that drives some of these increases in the share of farmers who report producing for sale at the end of the season compared to the beginning of the season. There's a secondary effect, which is that for most products, actually farmers at the end of the season are more likely to report these products for sale than at the beginning of the season. So farmers also seem to update their sort of commercialization decisions or intentions over time, and this likely contributes to the increase in farmers who are considered employed over time, but we think this is probably a secondary effect. I do want to also add one thing, which is not shown on this table, but we have it in the paper. These shifts can also to some extent explain why we do see these gender differences in Malawi at the end of the season, because at the beginning of the season, male and female farmers were fairly similar. 20% of male and female farmers reported producing for sale. But at the end of the season, we see the share increases to 58% of male farmers and to 40% amongst female farmers. So an increase for both groups, but a larger increase for men than for women. And we do see that men sort of predominantly work on goat rearing at the end of the season, while women work on chicken farming. And since chicken are less commercialized than goats, we think this can explain some of these gender differences that we see. Next, we move. So far, we looked really only at farmers, but now we want to move and say something also more generally about rural and urban labor statistics, and therefore we focus on the 2 data sets for which are nationally representative, the data sets from Malawi and Nigeria. And to some of the analysis choices, assumptions that we make throughout this process, what we show you is likely a lower bound for the implications of the new ICLS standards, because we tend to err on the conservative side. in our analysis choices. Of note, and I think that's important to emphasize, the share of farmers reclassified by the new standards is not necessarily indicative of the change in the employment to population ratio. This is for two reasons. First, because the impact on employment is muted in countries where very few people work in agriculture. You can imagine a situation where all farmers are reclassified, 100% of farmers are reclassified, but only half a percent of the population is engaged in agriculture. Even though the effect on farmers is drastic, it may not necessarily translate into large changes in labor market indicators at the national level or at the rural level. That's one reason. But the other reason is that farmers producing for our use may still be considered as employed if they perform secondary activities such as wage or non-farm household enterprise work that meets the criteria of employment, meaning it's work for pay or profit for at least 1 hour during the reference week or reference period. And that is quite common, actually. A lot of these farmers are engaged in multiple activities. So it's not an uncommon scenario that a farmer may not be classified as employed through his main activity, but her main activity, but maybe through the secondary activities, such as some hours of wage work, that farmer may still be considered as employed. So here we show what we find for the two data sets, and I'm not going to read out all these numbers, but you see that we see, particularly in rural areas, we see very strong or substantial reductions in rural employment to population ratios for both male and female farmers. Interestingly, the reduction in employment is stronger for women than for men in Malawi, but the opposite trend holds in Nigeria. And this is precisely because of the pattern that I just alluded to, which is that in many Nigerian women work in non-farm enterprises. So that sort of mutes the impact of these of the reclassification of farmers on sort of national or rural level indicators. We also see a very large drop in the share of the rural population engaged in agriculture, which declines by about 50% in Nigeria and by about 30% in Malawi, if we adopt to the new standards. So I'm going to turn to some concluding remarks. So what are the key takeaways? The rollout of the 19th ICLS standards has large implications for the characterization of particularly rural employment in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are also some implications for urban areas. There is, and Kieran alluded to this, there is a communication challenge here. We need to avoid the changes in labor indicators related to the introduction of new statistical definitions are conflated with real-world changes. And I think the last slide was an illustration of this. If you just look at sort of labor market indicators under the new standards, you would think that these two countries, Malawi and Nigeria, are much further along in the process of structural change than what you would think based on the previous labor market indicators. But of course, these are based on the same data. So in a sense, there's no change on the ground. All what we have done is updating to new definitions. And this is, again, a point that was already mentioned by Kieran. National statistical offices have to treat carefully in the implementation of the revised standards, and they should report on the full set of indicators outlined in the 19th ICLS resolution. This presentation focused only on employment, but the other indicators are extremely important, particularly because a lot of farmers are no longer considered as employed. So it's very important to also collect data on all-use producers of goods. It's also, I think, a good idea to reconstruct, at least in an interim, an additional employment series that follows the previous standards to get some sort of understanding of changes over time, at least in contexts where this is possible. So to have some sort of means to triangulate different employment series and understand what has happened in terms of longer-term trends. And special attention needs to be paid to the timing of data collection, particularly because we've seen that the share of farmers reporting to produce for sale can differ quite drastically between the start and the end of the season. And I do want to conclude with, since I have a little bit of more time, I do want to conclude with just two observations that I think are also important for this group, for this audience. And one is that, especially when working with data where one has not really done all the legwork of processing the microdata and the unit record data, such as when one works with labor databases, etc., it's really important to pay attention to metadata and data footnotes. And what you see here is a screenshot from the World Development Indicators, probably a data set or a data repository or database that is familiar to most of you. And I just give you the example of Rwanda and two series, employment to population ratio of according to the model ILO estimate and the employment to population ratio according to the national estimate. And you see that the two are fairly aligned in 2014 at about 83%. But then while there's the ILO model estimate stays pretty much the same. There's this sharp drop in the national estimate from 83% to 43%. And of course, this is because Rwanda decided in the interim to adopt the new standards, whereas the ILO sort of model database, because not at this point, not enough countries have sort of adopted the new definitions, especially for historical modeling, still applies the old definitions. But this is something that's easy to miss if one is not sensitized to these changes. It's possible to see them if you go on this little triangular shape. Then you do see some data nodes which say excluding unused production workers. So there are some nodes in the data that help you understand what's going on. But I think if one just casually looks at these data, that's something that's very easy to miss. The second point that we wanted to make, and that's my last slide, is
if you can wrap it up, yes, thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, that's the last slide. Is that caution is warranted when combining GDP and labor statistics. For example, when one measures sort of for the macro measurement of labor productivity, which is quite common to look at GDP per hour worked or per person as sort of a very broad and rough measure of labor productivity. And sort of under the 19th ICLS standards, the production of goods for own use counts towards GDP and national accounts, but not towards employment and labor statistics. And this is sort of the point that, or a similar graph to what was shown by Kieran in the first presentation. And you see the red bar at the bottom is the employment concept prior to 2013, which was aligned with at least in theory, with the SNA production boundary. It's also true that a lot of countries have always deviated from this in practice. So this link was never perfect, but now with a narrower employment concept, while the GDP definition has not changed, we have sort of a bit of a disconnect between the employment concept and production statistics. And that's important to bear in mind. It's possible in general to reconstruct from the microdata something or some estimates that should be sort of comparable to production estimates, but that in many cases requires access then to the microdata unless countries actually tabulate these statistics themselves. And so that's another tricky thing where I think data users have to be aware of that, yeah, that it's important to compare like with like. And with that, my presentation comes to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isis, very much. And thanks for the lively audience as well on the chat. Please keep the questions coming. I'm compiling them and we'll be dishing them out at the end of the session. So our final presentation will be by, it'll be a shared presentation by Antonio and Amparo. So let me introduce the presenters. Amparo Palacios-Lopez is a senior economist in the development data group of the World Bank. Her primary research interest is development with a focus on labor, gender, and welfare. She also conducts research on survey methods, as you'll appreciate soon, focusing on labor and agriculture. Antonio is a statistician and expert in labor market statistics, survey manager and a survey methodologist with more than 15 years of experience with various international organizations on a extensive range of activities, from training to methodological development for large-scale surveys, technical assistance and statistical capacity building to national statistical offices. So over to you, Antonio and Amparo. So this will be a 30-minute presentation, and I will again give you guys a heads up when there's 2 minutes to go. Thank you both.
Thank you, and good day, everyone. This presentation is about the main findings from a joint by ILO and World Bank study in Sri Lanka. This presentation is based on a study co-authored with Isis Gaddis and Kieran Walsh. This pilot study was carried out between 2017 and 2019 in collaboration with the Department of Census and Statistics of Sri Lanka, that we want to thank for the wonderful work we have done together. This is a continuation for both organizations of previous work to operationalize the 19th ICLS. Was supported by Data2X and William and Flora Hewlett Foundation under the Women's Work and Employment Partnership. And I also want to thank Data2X and the Hewlett Foundation for their support. The pilot study was designed to enable a comparison of the outcomes of two types of household surveys, namely the labor force survey and the multi-topic living standards survey. Objectives of the study were many. The first one, gain a better understanding of comparability of labor market indicators obtained from LFS versus MLSS type surveys. Assess and, if identified, reduce the undermeasurement of women's employment and work in LFS and MLSS. Pilot changes in either questionnaires that could narrow the differences and support the operationalization of the 19th ICLS standards. As you may notice, the first letters of these four groups forms the word gaps, and gaps is indeed a key theme of the study. The study was intended to fill the gaps in our knowledge of good measurement practice, fill the gap, understand the gap across surveys and being sure that the gender gap in labor market indicators is measured correctly. The first step of the study was a cognitive test. This aimed at verifying how respondents understood the question from the two different questionnaires. This consisted in a one-to-one in-depth interviews about how respondents have dealt with the structured questionnaire. It concerned with the mental processes by which respondents reach an answer rather than the answer itself. In fact, respondents were asked the survey being tested and a range of questions and probes about their experience of answering them. Different probing techniques were used: think aloud, concurrent, or retrospective probes. About 20 interviews per questionnaire were made. The second step was the fieldwork. The fieldwork conducted in 98 primary sampling units, the census blocks, basically, in 3 districts of Anuradhapura in the north of Sri Lanka, Galle in the southwest, and Kurunegala in the center. In each PSU, 10 households were selected randomly for the LFS and 10 for the MLSS, for a total of 980 households per questionnaire. The fieldwork took place in 2 waves, one in March-April 2019, a period of high agricultural work, and the second in September-October 2019 with a low agricultural season. The balance test showed that households were well balanced across treatment arms for most individual level and household level characteristics. The many topics were covered: the employment, a comprehensive coverage of all employment activities as defined by the 90th ICLS, thus work for paid profit, and also the measurement of the boundary between employment and own-use production of goods from agriculture and fishing. Then we covered labor underutilization, own-use production of goods, own-use provision of services, and working time in all these forms of work. Let's see something about the main findings regarding employment. First of all, based on the results from the cognitive testing, both questionnaires were updated from their original version. We learned that there is a need for careful review of translations, like the language used to describe agricultural activities. There is a need for careful wording of different working activities. For example, we had to update the wording to the initial LFS question on employment. That was work for wage, salary, or other pay, and became work for someone else for pay. And we did many other improvements of this type. Here you see a scheme for the flowchart for the identification of employment in the LFS. On the top, you see some core questions, and then there are questions to assess if the agricultural work is intended for the market or for use by the family. Now, a feature of this of the LFS questionnaire is that as soon as a person can be classified as employed, that respondent skips the next questions. And once the person is classified as employed, then there are two modules asking questions on main job and second job. This is the structure, the flowchart for the identification of employment in the MLSS. And you see that you have a set of core questions, multiple core questions. They are all asked to all respondents. But again, there is also there are also questions on the main intended destination of the agricultural production in order to classify people as employed or own-use producers as requested by the 19th ICLS. Now, you see some differences in the questionnaires of these two surveys that reflect the objective of the different objectives of the two surveys. Here we have a comprehensive, here in the MLSS, we have a comprehensive identification of all kinds of works already at the beginning of the questionnaire, which was not the case in the LFS. If you want to look at the effect on the employment to population ratios, we can look at this graph where we have the employment to population ratios for the two surveys, yellow the LFS, blue the MLSS, for the two waves and for both males, females, and totals. In wave one, the LFS identified 22% more employed women than the MLSS. You can see the red frame in the graph. And that led to 8.1 percentage points difference in the employment to population ratio for females. For males, the difference was about 3%. And that in total, the gap was about 10% between the two surveys. The employment to population ratio for the LFS was 5.5 percentage points higher than the MLSS. An in-depth analysis led to the conclusion that the gap emanated from the fact that the MLSS did not include any recovery questions, hence did not fully capture people engaging in more casual, low-hours job, helpers in family business and farms, primarily women. In wave two, many changes were made to the MLSS questionnaire, updating wording and adding questions to address those issues. Changes were successfully in significantly narrowing the gap, particularly for women. Now, a 6% gap among the two surveys is recorded for both men and women. And overall, the employment to population ratio is still higher for the LFS, but with a difference of 3.5 PPS from the MLSS. As a conclusion, we saw a clear sensitivity of wording questions to capture employment for specific key groups and type of workers at risk of misclassification, and a greater effect among women than men. We saw a need for recovery questions, for careful wording and translations into local languages to ensure that people with small jobs or people helping in family businesses or farms are identified as employed. When we see at the working time, we can see the effect of the measurement of working time looking at the distribution of employed by bands of hours worked. The graph contains the first two bars. It contains 4 bars. The first two are related to wave one, we have the first bar, the LFS, and second bar, the MLSS, and the last two bars for wave 2. We saw that both wave 1 and wave 2, an almost identical number of respondents had actually working time in all jobs of 40 hours or more in the reference week, the upper block in the graph. This suggests that both surveys were able to capture full-time employment. The difference were observed in the lower bands of working time in both wave 1 and wave 2. In fact, what we saw was that the MLSS had lower proportion of those employed with low hours. If you see the lower box, for example, people from employed working from 10 to 30 hours were 314 for the LFS in wave 1 and became 256 and are 256 for the MLSS. In the second wave, due to the changes made to the MLSS questionnaire, these gaps were reduced. An important conclusion is that casual, small jobs with low hours worked are relevant both for the employment measurement and for the working time analysis. Let's talk a bit about the recovery questions added in the MLS questionnaire. Cognitive interviews indicate that casual or on-account workers often do not consider themselves as having a job or being employed. And family workers perceive their work as help or support, but not as a job. These groups are thus less likely to respond affirmatively to questions that use the word employment or job. And we found that this is more common, it was more common among women, especially if the qualifying work was conducted concurrently with domestic activities. Therefore, recovery questions were used to recover these type of persons who were not classified as employed or as engaged in own use production work according to the initial set of core questions, although they were engaged in such activities, in those activities that would qualify them to be classified as employed. So the questionnaire for the MLS became a bit more complex. If we look at the red frames in the figure, we see that recovery questions were added in many places. And in the next slide, we look at the effect of these recovery questions. The two bars in the figure illustrate the share of employed identified by different types of questions, both males and females. Now, we have the MLSS had two recovery questions on helping on family farms in terms of crop farming and livestock production. And these two additional questions identified respectively 4% and 2% of employed women. Another two recovery questions identified slightly less than 3% of employed women and were related to people that run or do any kind of business, farming, or those who were engaged or were helping with business, farm, paid job of a household or a family member. Overall, we can say that without using the recovery questions, 9% of the employed women would not be captured as employed. This is clear if you look at the top left corner of the graph within the frame, the red frame. You can see that this effect was very high for women, but it was very low for men. Only 2% of the men in employment were identified through those 4 recovery questions. I think I can pass over the microphone to Amparo.
Yeah, so now we will focus on other interesting findings from the study. Next. As mentioned in the previous presentations, on-use production of goods covers a diverse range of activities performed by people to produce goods for their own household or family consumption. This includes subsistence farming or fishing activities, but also gathering, firewood, fetching water, manufacturing, clothing, or other household goods, among others. These activities may be subject to important gender asymmetries, including the fact that those activities are predominantly carried by women and are less frequently captured in the statistics. Thus, it is important to measure and report work on unjust production of goods jointly with employment, and it's also important to be sure that we're measuring it well. In wave one, the LFS, which is the yellow line, had higher levels of unjust production of goods for both males and females. This, as it had mentioned before, reflects the fact that the MLSS identified fewer family helpers and fewer other marginal workers in agriculture. As mentioned before also, in wave two, the MLSS questionnaire was updated, adding recovery questions and changing the wording to address the issue. As a result, the gaps narrowed. So as a conclusion, it's important to note that the questions targeting family farming work need to be chosen with great care. As Kieran mentioned, it is important to use locally familiar terms and to mention a range of relevant activities in the question text as examples. Next, unjust provision of services refers to the many services people provide to their own households or families without pay, including housework, gardening, small repairs, arranging services, caring for children, the elderly, or other dependent family members, and so on. It is useful to show the value of this data that this data can generate, especially in highlighting gender gaps that are often not visible because of infrequent data measurement. Female responders in the study in Sri Lanka, and this is not related with comparing both questionnaires, but just to highlight the gender differences. Female respondents in this study had approximately 3 times as much working time per week on average in the provision of services for own use than male respondents. So if you compare male, which is the 4 center bars, to the female, which are the 4 bottom lines bars, you can see that women produce, as mentioned, 3 times as much as 3 times, worked as much as 3 times as compared with men. This was true in both surveys, in both waves, and applying any different measurement approaches tested. In addition, and this is what we will show here, there is high sensitivity of the hours worked in these activities. In wave 1, the MLSS showed a substantially higher average number of hours worked per week, 32 hours compared to 24 hours in the LFS. This was mainly due to women doing care work for adults and children, with the LSMS estimate being 3 times the LFS estimate for this activity. The main disparity in wave 1 was the difference in implementation. While the 2 surveys used similar questions regarding care work, the LFS emphasized active caregiving and provided examples. So for example, one questionnaire asked, how many hours do you spend taking care of children? And the other one asked, how many hours do you spend actively taking care of children, and provided examples. After implementing active caregiving in both surveys and similar interviewer training, the gap completely reduced in wave 2. Next. Given the sensitivity of hours in unjust provision of services, we conducted a test in wave 2 on the use of 1 or 2 questions to capture working time in these activities. The 1 question approach used how many hours did you work in the last 7 days, and the 2 question approach used how many days did you work in the last 7 days, and then how many hours per day. The 2 question approach resulted in approximately 30% higher number of hours than the 1 question approach. This pattern was repeated among both men and women and consistent across surveys. A possible explanation is that respondents may round up daily averages when the 2 question approach is used, which leads to an overestimation relative to the 1 question approach. While the direction and scale of the impact are quite consistent, it is not certain which of the 2 sets of results is more valid, and more work is needed in this area. Next. Improving sectoral analysis is one important objective in the 19th ICLS standards. The labor input to any sector or grouping of working activities is a combination of paid and unpaid work. Work in agriculture and fishing includes both employment and own-use production of goods. In Way 1, the MLSS had difficulty capturing some of the agricultural work, and due to this, there was an improvement in Way 2 after the changes were implemented. While the proportion of agriculture and fishing workers identified by the LFS remained relatively stable, the proportion identified by the MLSS rose from 20 to 26%. The increase in the MLSS was greater among females, and this only highlights what we have been mentioning this about the gender gaps that exist in measurement, and about the importance of recovery questions and paying attention to gender when questionnaires are designed. Additionally, any comprehensive analysis of work in agriculture requires that surveys cover both employed and own-use production. Now let's say some summary conclusions. So the pilot study, and I want to highlight that the richness of the data it's too much. But we have been focusing only in this study on comparing both questionnaires and both approaches. But also we have all the data to compare the gender gaps within each of the questionnaires to trying to understand the situation in Sri Lanka. So the pilot study was incredibly valuable, and it has enabled and informed guidance on measurement of work and employment in LFS and other household surveys. The harmonization of questionnaire content represents a way to improve the consistency of measurement. Also, the study showed that greater consistency can be achieved, but with careful design. However, absolute consistency of results from different surveys should not be expected due to the different objectives and different design and methodologies across surveys. Additionally, the study reaffirmed that careful translation, national adaptation, and testing are essential components of survey design. Next. The study also highlighted how a much larger part of women's compared to men's work tends to be invisible or risks being underreported or simply not measured at all in official statistics. Special attention is needed in all surveys to ensure comprehensive coverage of employment and own-use production of goods and provision of services, particularly among women. Another area is measurement of working time, particularly unpaid care work. As we have shown, this is highly sensitive to the way it is asked. We have learned some lessons so far, but further work is planned. Regarding many other findings in the report, we found no major inconsistencies across questionnaires, given that the same set of questions was used in both surveys. So now what have we done with all of this? All these findings are available in the joint World Bank ILO report, measuring women and men's work, main findings from a joint ILO and World Bank study in Sri Lanka. The link will be, I will copy the link just as I finish my presentation so that you can see it. And we just want to highlight that the data that informed this study will be made publicly available in the near future. So what other instruments have this study informed? So we have guidance and tools. Next. As mentioned in Kieran's presentation, ILO has developed a rich set of guidance notes that can be found in their website. I'm pretty sure that Kieran will be pasting also all the links here, but it's also important to highlight that given all this guidance from the ILO and the World Bank, it is important to review different sources and choose the appropriate design, considering the survey objectives and country context. Next. The World Bank has written a guidebook on employment and own use production in household surveys. This is part of the LSMS guidebook series. It builds on 4 decades of extensive fieldwork experience and survey methodology research of the Living Standards Measurement Study at the team at the World Bank, and the work conducted by the World Bank and the ILO in Sri Lanka. It is an update of the Blue Book, Designing Household Surveys Questionnaires for Developing Countries, that has informed survey practitioners for nearly 4 decades. This guidebook provides, next one. This guidebook provides advice to statisticians and survey practitioners on the accurate measurement of employment and work in accordance with the standards of the 19th ICLS. This guidebook presents a modern labor module designed for the collection of labor data in accordance with the best practice standards. The model is appropriate for the collection of data in multi-topic household surveys. For example, household budget and income and expenditure surveys, living conditions monitor surveys, integrated surveys, etc. Other smaller scale or specialized household surveys, and any other surveys focused on collecting data on employment, labor, or related indicators, typically alongside other topics. It covers employment, underemployment, and unemployment, and on-use production of goods. But it is a living document and will be updated regularly when new modules or sets of questions are finalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Amparo, Antonio, so much, and thanks to all of you for the careful and very hard work, very operationally relevant work that you've took on for the past few years, with obviously huge implications in terms of how we report on and understand labor markets in developing countries. So thank you all again for engaging presentation. So we've had a lively chat in terms of the questions from the audience. I know that we have 8 minutes until the end of the session, but you know, I'm gonna eat into the break a little bit and devote at least 15 minutes for presentation. So to the extent that you can stick around during the break, that would be great. But then otherwise, we'll stick to the conference session. The next session starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm going to get started with some questions. I'm going to ask a question to each of you, just compiled from the chat. First question is to Kieran. Briefly, Kieran, if you could address in ILO's experience, whether ILO has observed any patterns in how uptake or lack of uptake of the recommendations been in country labor force surveys. Has that depended on factors specific to the nature of the labor market in that country, including size or of the informal sector or dependence of agriculture, or have there been other issues that we should be aware of regarding uptake?
Thank you, Tyler.
If you could take a minute. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Gayatri, for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting question. In my experience, it's actually depended on a range of factors, some of which are quite practical in nature. There is simply the issue of resources and expertise available to the country to make a major change to a survey they have in place. It's a resource-intensive and experience-intensive process, and we have helped many countries directly, as have the World Bank colleagues. But those that don't support us, we can't, or don't approach us, there's not much we can ultimately do. So we find that often there is reluctance to change as a result of lack of resources or lack of expertise. The other thing that we do feel it relates to is the frequency of labour force surveys or other related surveys. Perhaps contradictorily, where it's less frequent, there tends to actually be less resistance, notwithstanding the resource part, because they're a little bit less worried about the breaks in series. So if they're doing a labour force survey every 5 years, when we've been dealing with countries like that, they seem to be not hesitating too much once there have been discussions about the possible benefits of the 19th ICLS. There hasn't been too much resistance because if they understand the benefits, then they're not too concerned about breaks in series. Whereas countries with very regular series, quarterly, annual even, are very much concerned about the breaks in series impact and therefore need a lot more preparation, I think, to implement. For example, preparing good pilot studies so that they can estimate the impact of the change and try and link series together, as we've been speaking about this need to try and ensure continuity, which is achievable, but resource and expertise intensive as well. So I don't think, to me, it doesn't necessarily come down to the socioeconomic context of the country as more practical issues about the labour force surveys in place and the resources that the country has, even though that can be part of it, right? Countries with large agricultural sectors are going to see greater impacts, but I haven't personally witnessed that it's ultimately held most countries back from implementing. It has tended to be more about resources and expertise. Thanks.
Thank you, Kieran. So I'm going to go in order of presentations. I have a question for ISIS. So ISIS, one of the recommendations coming from the studies that you have summarized was to pay attention to the timing of data collection. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit in terms of how it would affect, say, multi-topic household surveys that typically span a 12-month period versus labor force, say, quarterly labor force surveys that are typically fielded. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Thank you, Talib. I think it's important to recognize that employment statistics in countries with large agricultural sectors were always sensitive to the timing of data collection. In a sense, this is not entirely new. We know that the fear of people who respond about being engaged in any type of work over the past some days can fluctuate quite a lot with the sort of seasonal changes in the agricultural sector, linked to the short reference period, which is sort of the core of labor statistics. But I think what's important to recognize is that now we have two margins of variation, essentially. We still have that fluctuation in and out of agriculture, which was always there, but now we have also a second margin of variation, which is sort of movements between sort of producing goods for own consumption and producing goods for the market. And I think that is important to consider, because even though I cannot prove it because we don't have the type of data yet where we sort of compare a ton of countries over long periods of time, I wouldn't be surprised if it enhances the sort of the seasonal variability of labor statistics. Now, if you have a continuous survey, I would say, that's probably still considered best practice, because then you have sort of the year-round picture, right? And ideally, if you have some level of representativeness by month or by quarter, then you can actually trace those changes. So I do want to caution, it may be quite, what I'm not quite sure is how this, is it a linear trend, or it can be highly nonlinear, right? You may have like the 2 weeks after the main harvest when nothing happens, but then things pick up again. That I don't think we know yet. So what is the time trend? This could be quite granular. And may not necessarily, and so once you start averaging 3 month periods, it may not necessarily be showing as much as it did show up in our data. But of course, if you do a one-shot survey, then I think it's all the more important, as it kind of was in the past, but reinforced under the new standards, to be very, very deliberate and to try to really be consistent in the season at which you implement the survey, if you're interested in reporting on trends. If you're filling these data sets at various times, I think it gets increasingly difficult to really interfere what is sort of a seasonal component here or what is sort of longer term trend.
Okay, Isis, thank you very much. So I'm going to have two questions. Antonio and Amparo, feel free to split them between yourselves. A question from Diana Kruger. She notes these methodological changes are likely to have an impact on the measurement of a share of youths that don't work or study. Have the pilot studies looked at how these changes affect adolescents and youths? And separately, Gary Fields also wondered about the production with contingent end use, and that is if I will sell it if the market price is high, or consume it myself if the market price is low. So how should we think about those cases when we are designing questionnaires with questions to capture intention to sell?
Let me start with this last question. And yeah, definitely it's a challenge. The intention to sell was explicitly pointed in the standards, and that's something that's there. We checked it, and that's part of what this is presented, that it changes by the season. So one of our speculations is that we have lower people report lower intention to sell at the start of the season because they don't know how well their production will be or how the prices will be, and they report higher at the end of the season. And that's, again, speculation. We will never know because everything is the intention. But at the end, given that the surveys are collected at different points in time, it needed to be one anchor to collect. And then ILO can come back. They have done a lot of work, and also they have modified a lot of questions to, if they cannot, because of course there's also the option for the respondent to say, I don't know. I don't know what I will do with my production at this point, but there are other follow-up questions. So it's not as simple as to say, okay, that's it, or we force the person to answer. There are other follow-up questions in which at the end ends up being, okay, what do you normally do? And they or what did you do the last season? So there are different ways of doing this. Of course, it's not simple. Anything, and I have to highlight this, anything that has to do with labor statistics and labor measurement is complicated, and this is just one other layer in this topic.
Yeah,
thank you.
On the net, we didn't do a specific study, a specific analysis in Sri Lanka on the NEET, but of course the introduction of the new resolution, of the 19th resolution, will have some impact because the level of employment will probably change, and the level of change depends on the country context. Let's make an example. Let's say we have a country where many youth produce for own family consumption, and that production is a consistent part of the livelihood. Now, under the old definition, those youth are classified as employed. So we have a small proportion of youth that are classified as a NEET. Now, under the new resolution, if those people, or if the youth have as an only activity a work in agriculture to produce goods for own consumption, these youth are classified as own-use producers and not anymore in employment if they do not have any other activity for classified as employment. Now we will have a different level of need, for example, but within those we can see those who are actually engaged in own-use production for own use. So we actually have an improved information. We have more information about those who are not employed. I hope that clarify the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Antonio, very much. So I'm going to ask actually one last question. I'm going to circle back to Kieran, just as custodian for many of these statistics and the first set of definitions that have been put forth. So Kieran, I think this is also an issue that Isis nicely framed in her presentation, but kind of a comment from Kunal Sen and maybe a related comment from Gary Fields. Is there any possibility that the 19th ICLS definition of labor force as work for pay or profit, this leads to an inconsistency between value added from national accounts and labor force measures, and undercounts employment in countries with large subsistence agriculture? And relatedly, Gary Fields noted clearly the employed, unemployed, and out of the labor force trichotomy will have to be replaced, but what will it be replaced by? So if you could kind of end us on those two notes, that would be great. Thank you, Kieran.
And I can be very quick. No, and it's a great idea. I'm sorry, and that's a joke. That's a joke. I take it more seriously than that. Yes, this is something. It's not. I mean, this is not a new discussion. These were also discussed, of course, in the development of the standards. It's not that the implications weren't extensively discussed and thought through for productivity measurement and various other purposes. Frankly, if anything, for the most part, I sense an escalation of commitment, particularly deriving from COVID, to the new standards, and the recognition on an increasing basis that existing statistics under the old framework, which simply identified people as employed, unemployed, or outside the labour force, or not economically active as it was then, was too blunt to describe reality. And particularly as there were repeated measurements during COVID, people seeing very slow reactions because, for example, people transferred from paid employment to own use production activities to maintain their livelihood. And if you just had a measure of employment, which is very wide and includes everything, you will never capture that. I mean, you can capture it through disaggregation in various ways, right? But at the headline level, it will look like nothing is happening, right, necessarily. So there is, in fact, I think, increasing demand in the last year to apply the standards, and I don't sense a very wide-scale appetite to go back and revisit them. What we do need, absolutely do need, is good and consistent application of the standards and reporting of this data. Where we will certainly end up with a problem is if countries measure employment according to the new definition, do not measure own use production of goods, and simply report as if nothing has changed. That will leave us in a very bad situation. And we know we have a lot of work to do on communication, on dealing with breaks in series to try and overcome these hurdles to application of the standards. But frankly, I don't see on a wide scale that the appetite is to go back and revisit the standards, rather to make sure that the standards are well applied. And there are failings here. I mean, there are countries who just update their employment definition, and even though they collect it, don't publish a measure of own use production of goods. And that is a step backwards. But it's a step backwards that can be dealt with by publishing the correct data. And productivity measurement is it's a very tricky issue. Like you go back in time and there is an assumption that the numerator and the denominator match in coverage. That often wasn't the case, right? I mean, it can be depending on how you do it, but it often wasn't the case. One of the objectives of the 19th ICLS is to make that more transparent. In other words, you measure by block the different working activities, and you measure by block the different production that comes from them, and you get a more nuanced and granular productivity measurement. But of course, it's not happening as widely as we would like it to at the moment. It is increasing in application. There are many good experiences for it now, and I think it will continue and accelerate in the future. But right now, we're in this in-between period where we're kind of, I think, stuck between two stools, and we need to move forward. I think, and so as regards to trichotomy, that trichotomy will continue to exist as reference to the new employment definition. But the key thing is it needs to be supplemented. We need to have these indicators of own use production of foodstuff, particularly where subsistence activities are high. We need to have these additional labor underutilization indicators to properly understand, because even in the old standards, unemployment in many settings was simply not meaning what people expected it to mean, frankly. It was coming up with 1 or 2% in countries with very weak labor markets. The new extended set of labor underutilization indicators shed a lot more light. We're seeing that on a continuing basis now with those countries that are applying the standards. So my appeal is let's all try and get the best out of the data and not just focus on 1 or 2 indicators, which at all times have been limited reflections of the reality of the labor market, and particularly now. We need more data, and we need better reflection on what is actually happening in labor markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran, very much. And I again wanted to thank the panel for the very clear and engaging presentations, and thanks everyone for sticking around, even though we went over our allotted time for a bit. Clearly, we have a long road ahead of us in terms of supporting the countries in updating their surveys and adopting new definitions, and that's not going to stop the debate on the definitional appropriateness from continuing. And as you can also appreciate from the various resources that colleagues have highlighted publicly, there's also still quite a bit of room for methodological development and advice provision. Not everything else is fully ironed out, and I think further methodological research and development is going to be key for us to be providing robust recommendations as a community. But thank you again for all of your leadership, panelists, and thank you again for joining us. So we're going to go on a break for a few minutes, and then we resume again in 6 minutes. Thank you.
Before we break, this is Gary. Could I just ask one very quick question? So am I correct in understanding that the 1 hour or more standard for employment is going to be retained under this new approach?
In short, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good work, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye, everyone.